Do you want to start the record?
Okay, I have.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Radha Upadhyaya. I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies, University of Nairobi, and my finance and development. So Matthew is a distinguished development economist who's had over 2 decades of teaching and academic experience at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London and University of Oxford, alongside visiting professorships in China, Pakistan, India, Japan, and South Korea. His work really spans a full breadth of development economics, from industrialization, trade, His most recent book follows the China-Pakistan economic corridor from the mountains of Kashgar to the port of Gwadar. And it's a very grounded and kind of very in-depth fieldwork research. Recently, he's turned his attention to Africa's urbanization, exploring how cities in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Zambia are being reshaped. On a more personal level, Matthew and I actually did our undergrad together in Cambridge. So we're just saying how we've known each other for more than 33 years. This July is like the 30th anniversary. And went to SOAS to do my PhD. And he used to organize the political economy of development seminars at SOAS, which I used to enjoy so much. And it's partly why I think I've put so much effort in organizing many of the IDS seminars. So welcome to Matthew. I'll give you about 25 minutes to 30 minutes to speak, and then we'll have a discussant. So thank you. Welcome to all of you who've joined. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any questions that you're thinking of whilst the presentation is ongoing, you may put them in the chat from now or ask them later. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Radha. I'm still stunned. It's been more than 30 years we've known each other, and a lovely way our kind of careers have overlapped at these nice moments. So big thanks, Radha, big thanks as well for Basil for logistics, and thanks as well for Dr. Priya from Moderator University for agreeing to be the discussant. Okay, so it's a kind of quite a squeezed half an hour seminar, so I've decided not to drop chunks of the presentation. I'm going to try and whip through quite quickly, so it might feel you know, a bit dashed, but I hope to give a broad overall perspective. So I'll start up, I'll look at why urbanization is important. I'll look at, although this is focused on Kenya, this is very much rooted in a comparative perspective, something I do enjoy doing. I'll have a look at the 13 country case studies we've chosen. I'll have a brief mention of the data. I'll talk about then the meat of the presentation, looking at the drivers of urbanization. So I think a lot of work tends to be focused on the implications of urbanization. So, you know, is there congestion? Is there affordable housing? Is there, you know, urbanization resulting in employment growth? But this is a step back. This is looking at the drivers of urbanization. And the takeaway from this is that this is a hugely important and profound change in political economy and economic development, this process of urbanization, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But it's actually very difficult to explain what's going on. You'd think there'd be big, obvious explanations for big, obvious social phenomenon, but it's quite difficult to tease out the explanations for the drivers of urbanization. Most people in the room, this is going to be self-evident. Anybody observing urbanization or ruralization, this will be a fairly easy question to think about. But it's not something economists really engage with. I mean, I spent, several decades learning and then teaching about development economics and hardly ever talked about urbanization, talked about cities. I talked about a lot of things connected with cities, like institutions or migration or industrializations, but rarely, if ever, mentioned cities and urbanization. And that is not just me, that is the economics, the development economics discipline more generally. We don't tend to like talking about space. So one reason urbanization is important, it is going to increase dramatically. It has been over the last 100 or so years, and we're now entering the last 5 decades of this century, the most rapid period of urbanization in human history. By urbanization, I mean an increasing share of the population living in urban areas. So for some countries, UK or Japan, they've hit about 90%, 85, 90%, and that share is no longer increasing. There's still, of course, urban churn. In London, for example, younger people tend to move into London for education or employment, and older people, when they have children, when they retire, move out of London. So there's urban churn, but urbanization in the sense of an increasing fraction of the population living in urban areas has essentially stopped in Japan, in the UK. Urbanization began in about 7,000 BC, probably Catalhoyuk in what is now Turkey. It took from 7,000 BC to 1800 for the share of the global urban population to go from 0% to 4%. So was that 9,000 years, 0% to 4%. By 1950, it reached 30%. By about 2020, it reached about 56%. The urbanization is forecast to come to an end in about 2100, when the global share will hit a plateau, a peak of about 85%. So half of all human urbanization will happen in the 21st century. So we are entering now the most rapid period of urbanization in human history. By between 2018 and 2050, about an extra 2.73 billion new urban residents will be added. And about 1 billion of that will occur in Africa, about 600 million of that will occur in South Asia. So this is South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are the epicenter of this final era of human urbanization. And what is also fascinating about this is throughout most of recorded history, urbanization has been associated with wealth. Where the big cities are is the bulk of the wealth in the global economy. This last phase of urbanization, much of that urbanization is happening in the poorest parts of the world. So by 2100, some of the biggest cities in the world will be in countries like South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Niger. That strong link between economic growth or wealth and urbanization has in many cases broken down. So what is also interesting about this is traditionally economists have seen urbanization as the outcome of other important processes, such as industrialization or changing patterns of consumer demand. However, kind of a new literature coming mainly from urban scholars argues that good urbanization can be they can generate employment, exports, industrialization. Good urbanization can drive economic growth. I spare you details, but here's one example of good urbanization. This is the Cooper Cafe in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. This is a cafe where Steve Jobs of Apple, Sergey Brin of Google, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, when they were young, upcoming entrepreneurs, used to meet for coffee. They used to share ideas. They used to meet potential financiers. They used to recruit skilled workers. This is an example of spillovers, of knowledge spillovers, a city bringing people together and creating, in this case, trillions of dollars of wealth. So thinking specifically here about the Kenya context, what I'm thinking of these two big contemporary regional patterns, we can see urbanization in much of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia is much lower than in the rest of the world, where urbanization is 20, 30, 40% rather than 50, 60, 70% as it is in much of the rest of the world. So two very distinct contemporary patterns of urbanization where it is low and is going to be increasing very rapidly in forthcoming decades. This shows the relationship of urbanization with GDP per capita. And again, we can see two very distinct patterns. We can see a lot of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa above the line where urbanization is higher than expected given relatively low levels of average income. And in the middle of the graph there, you can see India and Sri Lanka. South Asia is largely below that line. Urbanization is lower than we would expect given levels of GDP per capita. This shows that information in another way. We can see Sub-Saharan African countries, including Kenya, urbanization is very rapid. That's the percentage change in the urban population over the last 20 years. Urbanization, Sub-Saharan Africa going up very rapidly. In South Asia, it's increasing, but at a generally slower rate. There's some overlaps between those two countries, but I think generally the evidence is pushing us to see there are two very distinct patterns in contemporary urbanization. Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa, where urbanization is very rapid, particularly so in relation to levels of GDP per capita, and in South Asia, where urbanization is increasing, but at a slower rate. This list comes from a study which was trying to forecast city populations in 2100 and shows that by 2100, the 10 largest cities in the world by population are all going to be located in Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. So gone, Mexico City, Tokyo, Chinese cities, etc. The 10 largest will all be in Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. So thinking about drivers of urbanization. So what we wanted to do for this study was pull out some case studies where urbanization was being driven by the same economic factors. I won't dwell too much on the method here, but in some cases, urbanization can be driven by resource rents. So if we take Luanda in Angola, for example, high oil prices create wealth among a minority of elites. They use that luxury accommodation to dine out at restaurants, to go to shopping malls. It's resource rents that drives urbanization. Conflict also has a complicated relationship with urbanization. So in Uganda, for example, the population of Kampala was swollen by people seeking refuge or safety in Kampala. Urban economic crisis can also impact urbanization. So, for example, in the 1980s, 1990s, the urban population of Zambia declined as its copper-based economy went into decline. So what we did, we came up with a filter to select countries from Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia where urbanization was not being driven by conflict, where it was not being driven by dependence on natural resources. So we could say this sample of 8 Sub-Saharan African, 5 South Asian countries, we could be reasonably sure it was a comparable case study and wherein urbanization was being driven by the same economic factors. Now, that I'll spare you the technical details of the sample selection there, but then when we came out with 8 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, 5 in South Asia. Now, a problem here is that we're using this aggregate data on urbanization, the share of the population living and working in urban areas, and there are big questions about the reliability of this data. I've had a kind of an ongoing debate with Priya thinking about the reliability of the data in Sri Lanka. So the capacity of the state in many of these countries, we may question its ability to collect data on urbanization, particularly so that a lot of that urbanization is occurring in the informal sector, informal employment, informal or slum-based housing. And also to compound those problems, the definition of urban does differ across those 13 countries in our sample. For example, some countries, for example, automatically define any minimum population, so reaching 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 as an urban area. Others tend to use a political definition, so they have a particular administrative boundary and they count urbanization within that boundary and ignore the population outside. So what I would say here is that yes, we do acknowledge the problems with the data, but we realize we argue that the puzzle is real, is just not an artifact of the data. This rapid urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa and slower urbanization in South Asia. That the countries in this sample size, they have equivalent problems with state capacity. They have equivalent problems with measuring informality. If we compared, for example, Mumbai and Nairobi, a similar proportion of their populations live in slums, in the informal sector, working in the informal sector across those two cities, Nairobi and Mumbai. There's no particular reason to think that urbanization is systematically counted differently or less well in Sub-Saharan Africa as compared to South Asia. If we compared countries there using the same minimum population definition of urbanization, so Kenya and countries in South Asia, we do still see this distinct difference. Lower urbanization, slower increase in urbanization in South Asia, faster in Kenya and other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this graph shows measures of urbanization using a consistent definition of urbanization and nightlight data from the Africopolis data set, and showing this very distinct acceleration in Sub-Saharan Africa. We lack the equivalent data for South Asia, though. Just as an aside, this presentation research is focused on rural to urban migration, which probably explains, the data is not great, but probably explains about 60% of urbanization. Some portion of urban population growth is driven by natural population increase. That's differential patterns of fertility and mortality within cities. So it's about 60% of urbanization is explained by rural to urban migration. So then what are the drivers of urbanization? So 5 hypotheses, big important hypotheses that don't really seem to be helping us explain, rapid increase in Kenya or elsewhere in Sub-Saharan Africa and much slower in South Asia. First, those is comparative advantage. So very simply, this hypothesis says that when a country has a comparative advantage, has lots of land, people should linger longer in agriculture. It should have a comparative advantage in agriculture. Where a population country is more densely populated, that should push people into cities, into urban industry. Here, this shows that on the whole, South Asia is much more densely populated than India. At the bottom, their population density, it's like 1/5 that in India, probably less than 10% that in Bangladesh. So we would expect South Asia, according to this hypothesis, to be urbanizing, to be industrializing faster than Sub-Saharan Africa. So the data here, this hypothesis really doesn't help us explain what's going on, which is exactly the opposite. Sub-Saharan Africa urbanizing fast is that of urban pull. This is the urban economy urbanizing, creating employment and pulling people out of rural areas. So this graph shows relative wages between rural and urban areas in the 13 countries we're looking at, with the exception of suggestive evidence here showing that in Kenya, relatively high urban wages are pulling people out of rural areas. However, there's no real distinct difference here between Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Bangladesh urbanizing quite rapidly, but relatively low urban wages. So perhaps some explanation here for Kenya, but clearly this doesn't really help us explain the Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia distinction. This is share of which urban areas are pulling people out of rural areas by creating but again, this shows Africa. We see relative in industry and much stagnant shares in Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, this hypothesis is exactly the opposite of what we would expect. It is not Sub-Saharan Africa that's creating industrial jobs and pulling people. It's difficult to explain the empirical phenomenon with this hypothesis. And thirdly, is it easier to build cities in Sub-Saharan Africa? So this is focused on institutions, a big orthodox idea in economics, in development economics. Institutions that has created lots of Nobel Prizes. Among the most important institutions are that of property rights, defining who can own, control, dispose of resources, land, ability to sell, rent, or transfer property. And Douglas North famously declared that property rights are the underlying determinant of long-run performance of economies. So for the sake of this presentation, we have considered a measure of property rights is that of construction permits by the World Bank, the ability to get a permit to build. This shows there's no exact overlap. In order to explain the data, we would expect construction permits to be much easier to get in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's not an exact overlap, but on the whole, there's suggestive evidence here. It's easier to get a construction permit in South Asia. Kenya, it's difficult. It's lengthy delays to get a construction permit in Kenya. It's clearly not the ease of getting a construction permit, which is explaining why Kenya is urbanizing rapidly. This is similar evidence. This shows how easy it is, not just time with construction permit index produced by the World Bank. Again, we don't see a distinct difference between South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We certainly can't argue here that Sub-Saharan Africa is urbanizing rapidly because it's easier to get construction permits. So the institutions, property rights argument does not really help us explain what's going on. This hypothesis, rural push, suggests that a lot of economics says that you need a surplus in agriculture, a surplus of food grains in order to facilitate urbanization. So more food grains, they can feed urban workers. Lower price of food grains, rising output means firms can employ workers at lower wages. More food grains mean the government can get tax revenue from agriculture and build urban infrastructure. More agricultural output that can be exported, and the urban sector can use that foreign exchange revenue to import the machinery, the inputs needed for urbanization. Here we see our proxy measure for rural productivity is cereal yield, kilograms per hectare. And the comparative data here shows that cereal yields have been relatively high and steadily rising in South Asia, and they are much lower and stagnant in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the rural push hypothesis, again, it's exactly the opposite of what we would expect. It's South Asia that's generating an increased surplus in agriculture that we would expect to be promoting to facilitating urbanization. Related to that is the idea of climate change. So declining rainfall, hindering agriculture and pushing people out of agriculture into urban areas. And we don't see here any clear relationship between changes in rainfall and changes in urbanization. So, for example, Malawi and Pakistan have both had relatively slow rates of urbanization, but we see dramatic differences in their patterns of rainfall. So there's not that clear negative relationship we would expect if it is the case that differential patterns of climate change are impacting or creating these two distinct models: rapid urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa and slower urbanization in South Asia. And finally, a big hypothesis that doesn't help us explain what's going on is that of ease of migration. So rural push or urbanization or a rural push or urban pull are about the incentives created by what's going on in rural areas and urban areas. So this is about the ease of responding to those changing incentives. Can people physically migrate? And a proxy for that, we've used road density, kilometers per thousand population, as a proxy measure to capture the ease of migration. And again, this is the countries with the greatest road density are in South Asia. The countries with the lowest road density are in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we would, again, exactly the opposite. We would expect to see easier migration occurring in South Asia than Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, this doesn't really help us explain what's going on. And kind of drawing towards the end here, three hypotheses that do seem to help us explain what's going on. The first of all is that of relative rural deprivation. This is the idea that people don't just think about what's going on in agriculture or in urban areas to make a migration decision. They look at relative measures. We captured data on national poverty surveys looking at the ratio between urban and rural poverty. The graph here shows that we would expect much higher ratios of rural poverty to urban poverty to act as an incentive to migrate. But we don't see any clear relationship here. So Kenya has got relatively low levels of rural urban poverty, but has quite rapid rates of rural to urban migration. We see, for example, in Rwanda or Guinea, much higher levels of relative rural poverty, but much slower rates of rural to urban migration. So this is not really helpful in explaining these differential patterns. Now, what does work is...
It's about 25 minutes, okay. So maybe you can have 5 to 8 more minutes, please.
Okay, yeah, I'll whip through the last bit. What does help us explain is public services. If we look at electricity, or we look at sanitation, or we could look at health and education, there are massive differences here between Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Over the last 20 years, in rural Sub-Saharan Africa, it was very difficult to get sanitation, to get electricity. One had to move to an urban area. There are huge discrepancies in the delivery of public services over the last 20 years between rural areas and urban areas in Sub-Saharan Africa. If we see in South Asia, the ratios are much more equal. Governments in South Asia have long been much better at providing public services to people in rural areas. And this is probably influenced by the much stronger rural vote in South Asia than in Sub-Saharan Africa. So big explanation here: if one wanted good public services in Sub-Saharan Africa, one had to migrate to a city, whereas relatively decent public services have long been provided to rural areas in South Asia. Second big hypothesis is that of the problem of the primate city. This is about the functioning of politics, constraints on the executive, the idea that some presidents will build cities, will build infrastructure, build statues, open state-owned enterprises, build roads, build railways in favoured areas, often the capital city. So this argument, it's a kind of political argument about generating inflated, rapid urbanization because of politics. And a rough measure of the primate city, the extent of this problem, is the proportion of the population living in the largest city. And that differs fairly systematically between Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. In Sub-Saharan Africa, a much larger fraction of the population live in the largest city. So this is suggestive, but not compelling evidence that there's a greater problem of the primate city, that politicians, presidents lack constraints on their executive authority. They're able to inflate urbanization in particular favoured areas through diverting public spending and public investment. It's suggestive because maybe it's just because you've got 1.5 billion people in India, 250 million people in Pakistan. It's always going to be the case that the share of the population in those huge countries is going to be much lower in the primate city. This is a hypothesis that we're still in the process of thinking about and researching. The idea that insurance networks could be stronger in South Asia. So people living in rural areas have access to informal insurance networks through kinship and other institutions that mean they have insurance in terms of drought or adverse weather conditions or employment shocks, and they stay in rural areas in order to maintain access to those informal insurance networks. And there's quite a bit of writing on Sub-Saharan Africa which says people use insurance networks work quite differently in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, that they facilitate migration. When some people from a particular area or group or tribe or village migrate to rural areas, they act as an information network that helps subsequent migrants from the same network migrate to cities. So there's possibility here that these type of informal networks are facilitating migration in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa and slowing migration in the case of South Asia. So drawing to a rapid urbanization in Kenya and other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, much slower in the case of South Asia. A caveat, we haven't considered mortality decline. We're focusing on that portion of urbanization that is explained by rural to urban migration. And what I think is fascinating about this, we've got this massive social and economic change occurring over now and over the next few decades. Very distinct, lower than expected in South Asia, faster than expected in Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's very difficult to explain. We don't really have, the smoking gun, the convincing evidence here. Some of the big hypotheses, comparative advantage, urban pull, institutions, rural push, seem to be explaining actually the complete opposite. They seem to be suggesting that it's South Asia that should be urbanizing faster. We found some explanations in relative rural deprivation, particularly the much lower success in Sub-Saharan Africa in delivering public services to rural areas, some suggestive but not convincing evidence in the case of primate cities, and this argument of social networks working differently, promoting urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa and slowing it in South Asia. Perhaps there's some explanation going on there. But I think the big takeaway from this is rapid urbanization in Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa. The two big explanations, that of poor delivery of public services and the problem of the primate city, both in the end reflect policy failures, public policy failure to deliver public services to rural areas, and the problem of the primate city being one of perhaps the functioning of democracy, the lack of constraints on the executive, enabling the executive, the president, rapid rate of urbanization. So this would imply the big takeaways are its economic policy and political failure driving the more rapid urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa is a bit of a concern. We can genuinely raise the concern that urbanization is too rapid in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not to then engage with the idea that the future of sub-Saharan Africa is rural or in its villages. The future of sub-Saharan Africa is very much urban, but we can raise concerns that it is occurring too fast and is risking overwhelming the capacity of governments in sub-Saharan Africa to successfully manage urbanization. And it is reasonable to conclude from that that governments in sub-Saharan Africa should think about ways of slowing it down, such as improving public service delivery in rural areas, or perhaps political reform that reduce the ability of the executive to promote inflated, rapid urbanization. So I will draw to a halt there and pass over to Priya. I think we'll share some thoughts as the discussant. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. It was really a fascinating presentation. I'm not an urban scholar, but just as someone who lives in Nairobi, I just found it really fascinating how kind of all the kind of obvious explanations for the rapid urbanization were not compelling. So thank you for taking us through that. Thank you all who are attending. I see we have, at one point we had about 50 participants. We now have about 47. We do appreciate your time. We know there's so many webinars going on every day, and so we don't take your presence for granted. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our discussant, Dr. Priyanwada Singhapathirana. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Town and Country Planning at the University of Moderator, Sri Lanka, where she's been shaping the next generation of planners since 2015. With the Foundation in Town and Country Planning from University of Moderator, an MSc in Urban Development from UCL, and a PhD from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, her work has a big kind of interdisciplinary focus as well. It focuses on the intersection of land rights, housing, urban economies, and explores how systems shape cities. I've always said the hardest part of organizing a seminar is not getting the speaker, who's always, many people want to share their research, but it's finding a discussant. So thank you, Priya. We approached you quite last minute and you agreed to step in, and we really appreciate. So I'll give you about 8 minutes to make your comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Radha, for the invitation. Actually, I take this as an opportunity to learn. So thank you very much for inviting for this seminar. So Professor Matthew, thank you for that thought-provoking inquiry on urbanization in Kenya. So let me quickly get into the points as we have limited time. So the first thing I observed in this inquiry was this theoretical positioning, because I found this engagement with theory is quite insightful, because it's useful to see how the existing theoretical frameworks are used to interpret the findings, because it allows us to raise important questions or critical questions, such as to what extent these existing theories can explain the current realities on ground. So do we need to adapt these frameworks, or do we need to develop new concepts and theories that can better explain the emerging dynamics in our cities, especially with this rapid changing environment? I think it's not simply for academics, but even for practitioners, these theories can give very important lenses for us to look at the reality and construct knowledge. So maybe since I'm an academic, I find that very, sort of insightful. But yes, it's important for practitioners as well to question what we observe on our ground. And coming to the key focus, so the question of why Kenya is experiencing such a rapid or exceptional urbanization is central to this discussion. So I think, again, understanding the underlying drivers with several hypotheses, I find it very useful because we have to question these underlying assumptions like industrial sector domination and rural push, Likewise, Professor Matthew mentioned about the hypothesis. So because questioning why certain things happen in a certain way is important, because understanding the root causes correctly is necessary prior to make any interventions. Otherwise, we can make assumptions, and if we make interventions with assumptions, we may come into wrong policy decisions. So theoretically, I think identifying these drivers is the key for our informed policy decisions, particularly related to urban planning, city planning, for infrastructure provision, and also to determine the public financing priorities. So in that sense, why this happened in Kenya, I think that's the central question, and that's very, very important in theoretical and also practical sense for policy formulation. And the other thing I found was about this spatial manifestation of urbanization. So now, at this research, in this research you talked about the density, and you compared the density in Asia and Africa. So there, that attention was there, but I see like maybe it could be an extension to this research, because I think looking at the spatial manifestation of urbanization is important, because we have to understand how this urbanization unfolds spatially. Because yes, we question why it happens, but how it happens can be different. Now, for an example, like understanding the spatial forms and spatial patterns is critical. For instance, let's say there can be countries with comparatively similar rates of urbanization, institutional structures, or economic compositions, but the spatial manifestation can be different. Now, in your data, we saw now Kenya has a rapid urbanization, but in terms of density, if I'm not wrong, it has a lower density than Sri Lanka and India. Right? So when this urbanization happen, for instance, let's say sometimes it can be a vertical development with densification where the infill development happen in cities. And alternatively, it can comes with a edge expansion in city with low to medium density settlements. So likewise, this urbanization can take different forms on space, and these different forms has to be addressed differently in our planning interventions. So I think understanding that spatial manifestation also will be very, very important and will add a value to this type of a research. So if we can, bring that insight also into the discussion. And the other one, I think we previously also had this discussion with Professor Matthew. It's about this redefining what is urban. So because there is a big gap in terms of the definition, right? So if we, because there is a very significant risk associated with both overestimating or underestimating the urbanization, because it can lead into the misallocation of resources and infrastructure provisions, etc. Therefore, understanding the level of urbanization correctly is very, very important. But unfortunately, I think the dilemma here is we can't wait, until we get all the information or get the census get the right, information for us. So we have to make decision with incomplete information. So that's the interesting part here. So. And the other thing you mentioned at the very end of the presentation, I find it very important, because this urban expansion may not be always, because there can be lots of negative externalities of urbanization, such as this urbanization can happen with environmental degradation, infrastructure pressure, so much need for capital investment from the public sector. Likewise, so therefore, I think we have to also understand this cost of urbanization as well when we talk about our urbanizing cities. And those are some of the key thoughts came to my mind when I was listening to your presentation. And I also would like to clarify a few things from Professor Matthews. Now, when we look at this, you had this comparison between the Asia and the Africa. So I was wondering now, if we compare Asia and Africa, now Asia has a large urban agglomeration, and if you look at the absolute numbers, there is a large agglomeration, but in terms of the phase of urbanization, Africa is urbanizing faster. So, so what explains these different speeds? Like, is it related to different stages of structural transformation? For example, now Asia has already come into a stage of industrialization and moving from agriculture to industry, but Africa is still at a different phase. So I was wondering why these different phases, what can explain, right? And in terms of the causes also, right? Maybe the conditions in rural life, right? The quality of rural living, can that also be a main cause for the migration? Because, like, for an example, if we take Africa, like climate vulnerabilities or any other factors, are there such factors that push people from rural to urban areas? That's one question. And the other one, I was wondering now, what role do land tenure systems and property rights play in shaping this urbanization? Because now I'm not very thorough with the property systems in Africa, but as per my knowledge, in Kenya, there's a customary land tenure that's very significant. Am I right? So in such situation, does that facilitate or accommodate more flexible urban development, particularly in terms of building affordable houses or providing public services? Water management, because I have very brief, I had some experiences from Dar es Salaam. So in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, what I observed was they had a very unbelievable level of capacity in terms of community organization. Local governments are weak, but community is very strong and they are very well organized in terms of service provision, such as water supply, waste management, and building houses for themselves likewise. So they are very well organized. And that was an exceptional experience I had. So I was wondering whether that type of mechanisms, relationships in urban areas, and also this customary land tenure, is it also a big reason for Kenya and African countries to bring people to their cities so they have flexible mechanisms? Right? So those are the two, key questions that I would like to clarify from you. There are many things that I would like to discuss, but let me stick myself into these two questions.
Thank you. Wonderful. Radha, I think you're still muted.
Thank you so much, Priya. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss and also provide questions. Matthew, if you're okay, I'll read a couple of questions from the chat.
Far away.
And then take together. So let me take, Priya's questions and then 3 questions from the chat. So that there's a question from Dr. Marian Uma. And she says the push reasons for rural-urban migration have changed over the years, considering there are now many digital jobs that young people are choosing to work from rural areas. What is the socioeconomic profile of those who migrate? Is it different from previous migration patterns? Then Victor Bohr is asking, Kenya has faced challenges from insufficient infrastructure to support urban populations. The ongoing floods in Nairobi are testament of this. The ongoing housing program by the government. Do you think that initiative is sustainable in countering the surge? Considering the rate of urbanization, do you think Kenya has the capacity and the political will to cope? Paul Terkumbar says, thank you, Matthew. I wish to ask about the state-of-the-art smart transport in Kenya, the city's mobility and governance as drivers for sustainable urbanization. So let me take those 3 and then you can answer those together with Priya's questions, maybe in about 5-6 minutes, and then we'll take another 3-4 questions from the chat.
So Priya, you said something, do we need new concepts, new theories? I mean, I've stuck up 8 there that quite widely accepted across different literatures as drivers of migration. But in the end, I'm thinking of a fairly crude definition of urbanization, just the share of the population living in urban areas. I mean, in practice, urbanization is much more complicated. There's circular migration, people move into cities, they come back, temporary migration. There's important dynamics at the household level. Some members will move to the city, some remain in rural areas. Living, sometimes people live in rural areas but commute into work in urban areas. So in reality, urbanization is much more complicated, and any one of these ideas, we could change the definition of think of much more nuanced patterns of urbanization. I mean, just for the sake of everybody's sanity, I mean, I've got 13 countries, I've got 8 hypotheses. I've come up with a fairly crude definition of urbanization. Otherwise, it would just, I think, introduce too much complexity into the analysis. What I think is, the big takeaway here is the idea that, a lot of writings about this, you talk about the importance of understanding the root causes. I think too often people don't think about the drivers of migration, and they present to policymakers, urbanization, this is happening, this is the pace of urbanization. You must kind of take this as given and then manage the consequences of that. You must help cities integrate into the periphery as they expand outwards. You must switch from low-level buildings to high-rise buildings. So thinking about the pace of urbanization as a potential variable that can be influenced by policy is one of the takeaways here. And I think that's the importance of research like this, is that it's suggestive that urbanization is occurring too quickly in much of sub-Saharan Africa, and that perhaps the government should seek to intervene in a way to slow down that pace. That's not to say, as I mentioned, that the future of Africa is going to be anything other than urbanization, and that urbanization can generate enormous benefits in the long term. It's the question of, is it just too rapid and it risks overwhelming the capacity of governments to manage. Very interesting points about density, spatial manifestation of urbanization. Again, this is, I think, not talking about that as a consequence of just thinking about a fairly crude aggregate level of urbanization, just the share of the population living, working in urban areas. I mean, in reality, it can be a very different process. If you look at the urbanization in Seoul in South Korea compared to that in Nairobi, Seoul, South Korea managed very rapid urbanization without the proliferation of slums. They were fairly good at building good transport and affordable housing, much better than contemporary Nairobi. So Seoul managed to urbanize without creating slum populations. So how density differs between countries, how it differs over time, how it differs within cities, in different areas of cities. I think these are hugely important questions, but I would probably push that to thinking about extensions to this research rather than trying to squeeze it into the research. It would risk making it too complicated. I mean, what explains different patterns? I mean, my 2 big explanations are policy failure, that for most of the last 20, 25 years, if you wanted decent public services in sub-Saharan Africa, you had to move to cities, whereas they were pretty much already available in rural areas for much of that time in South Asia. And then also democracy works differently. Constraints on the executive politicians are less in much of sub-Saharan Africa, which has enabled them to build infrastructure, to build roads, railways, open state-owned enterprises for political criteria, and you allocate those types of spending to politically favored areas, which has promoted a kind of an artificially inflated pace of urbanization in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So whether that's amenable to any simple policy suggestions, make democracy function better, reduce constraints, or increase constraints on the executive, those are difficult questions, not really amenable to simple policy solutions. Land, weather differences in land, customary land in Sub-Saharan Africa, that differs. I would perhaps agree, differs significantly to South Asia. Whether that can help us explain faster urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's a great question. It takes us to property rights, institutions. For this research, we use fairly simple measures of construction permits as our measure of institutions and couldn't find much explanatory power here. It would be very interesting to think, what is the hypothesis? Why would customary land tenure potentially accelerate my urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa relative to South Asia? Would be worth investigating, and thank you very much for the suggestion. Thinking about digital jobs, the ability of people to work in rural areas in well-paying jobs. Yes, I mean, this is a global debate, the extent to which being able to be online will reduce the benefits of being in cities. Do you still need to be in a city to engage in knowledge exchange? Perhaps this seminar is a perfect example of us engaged in knowledge exchange without all having to sit in a coffee shop and meet each other in person. I think that's a fascinating debate. I think the research that's coming out seems to show that it is still important to engage in face-to-face discussion, to participate in knowledge exchange. There's a comment there about the social profile of migrants. Again, it's very important, but it's a nuance, or it's a complication I've completely ignored for the sake of this presentation. I'm just talking about the share of the population in urban areas. I'm not thinking about the age profile, the skill profile, who exactly is comprising that migration. Capacity to cope was one of the questioners. I think that is a big important factor. The speed of urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa is so vast, relative to Sub-Saharan Africa's history, relative to the history of the rest of the world. I think there really are worries about the ability of Sub-Saharan African city governments or national governments to cope. And it is always worth remembering that how cities are built today has a lock-on effect, has a permanent impact on how they develop in the future. I mean, it is still the case in Europe, 2,000 years after the Romans built the roads, patterns of urbanization in Europe are still explained in part by where and how Romans built roads 2,000 years ago. So, it is very difficult to retrofit a city. If a city sprawls slums without adequate space for roads, it's very, very difficult to then go in later and put in a decent road network or sewage sanitation system. So excessive urbanization today makes it permanently difficult to alter the path of that urbanization in the future. Sub-Saharan Africa risks getting locked into kind of low productivity, crowded pattern of urbanization. Smart transport as a way of mitigating this, I think. Yes, I mean, that would be, what are the policy suggestions? How does Sub-Saharan Africa cope with this very rapid pace of urbanization? I mean, I focused on one set of policy solutions to look at the causes and perhaps think about slowing the pace of urbanization to a more manageable, sustainable level. I mean, better coping with urbanization, so smart transport or mobilizing domestic tax revenues to better provide urban infrastructure and public services, or improving the capacity of government to better plan the expansion of cities are, a range of alternative policy solutions. Great suggestion, and probably should be added to the list of thinking about policies to cope with rapid urbanization. But I'll draw to a halt there and pass back to Radha in case there's time for more questions.
Yeah, we have about half an hour left. So thank you. A lot of these suggestions may again be contradictory. If part of the reason for the rapid urbanization is kind of the very poor public goods in rural areas, kind of improving transport, which we all want in Nairobi, can actually in a way even have kind of a more rapid urbanization. But I'll use my position as chair to ask one thing linked to the point on the kind of the primate city and governance issues. Kenya, since 2010, has had one of the most, I think, interesting and kind of seismic changes in governance that we could have expected with devolution, or was expected to have and yet again, maybe this is something that is a more kind of in-depth, but what would be your views? Because I don't feel that that has actually changed the migration to Nairobi that much. And if you have any views on that. I'll just read 3 more questions. Justice Ongo is asking about your conceptual framework, which seems a bit rigid and tailored to exclude the complexities of time or historical drivers, such as specific country land tenure, organic urban population growth, and generational exponentiality. Cliff is asking about, sorry, that's more of a comment. Justice again is asking, what proportion of population growth is accounted for by migration versus intergenerational growth? Gregory Adroer, urban population is growing very fast at the same time, and we don't have urban land to accommodate this. Will we start eating into the farmlands, and then how will the urban population be fed? Samira Anwar is saying thank you. And what are some of the environmental problems that would spill over into future generations if urbanization continues at this rapid rate? Wellington has put 4 questions. And what I'll do is I'll just pick number 2 and 3, just randomly. So could the inability of many Sub-Saharan African countries to provide reliable bulk of infrastructure, electricity, water, sewage, be a decisive factor in slowing urban to rural migration? I think that, and when redefining urban, what truly explains the divergence in urban agglomeration political choices? So I'll ask you to go with those, but it would be also useful if we have a bit of time at the end, or you could maybe look at Wellington's questions in the chat and respond to the other 2 questions as well.
Thank you very much, Paul. Great list of questions there. My goodness, only half an hour to get through this question. Okay, so Radha, you were pointing out, this public goods has a contradictory impact. I mean, I agree completely. So let's say I was explaining one of the drivers of urbanization, or the differential drivers of urbanization, why faster in Sub-Saharan Africa over South Asia, is that public services have been much better provided in rural areas in South Asia. If you wanted access to decent schooling, sanitation, you could by and large achieve that in rural South Asia, unlike rural Sub-Saharan Africa for most of the last 20 years. But at the same time, as you say, it has a contradictory impact, because if you boost education in rural areas, that will in the long term facilitate migration, because better educated people will tend to leave agriculture and seek employment in urban areas. So the big kind of backdrop idea is that this is not, I'm not making an argument for thinking agriculture is the long run future for Sub-Saharan Africa, or somehow Sub-Saharan Africa people can stay in villages and small towns. The future is urban for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's just, I think, the pace with which that is achieved. Now, I suspect had primary schools been better provided in rural Sub-Saharan Africa over the last 20 years, that would have slowed down the process, the short-term process of migration. It would have backloaded it. I mean, eventually people would have become literate and sought better jobs in urban areas. So this is it's not a question of rural or urban or agriculture versus industry. The long run future is going to be urban, but it's the pace at which that is going to unfold is the big argument. The argument about the point about the primate city. So evidence I drew from this is some work, for example, on skyscrapers that shows that democracies build fewer skyscrapers than authoritarian governments, and a country that becomes more authoritarian over time shifts to building more skyscrapers. And that's not about geography, that's not about oil wealth, that's that is a causal factor linked to the type of political system. There's also quite a lot of evidence which shows presidents tend to favor particular locations when it comes to building roads or railways, often their home area, their home village, or the capital city. So putting these together is the argument that the nature of the political system, if it's an more authoritarian system, if there's fewer constraints on the executive, then politicians are more likely to be promoting a kind of artificially inflated process of urbanization by opening state enterprises, building infrastructure in their home village, their home region, or the capital city. So whether decentralization influences the primate city problem, it's kind of a different question. It's the level of government rather than the functioning of government. So I'm saying it's the functioning of government which is important. You get a politically driven infrastructure when you have fewer constraints on the executive, less democratic government. The level at which government is happening is probably not the most important question, I would say, for that. It might be the case that more decentralized government is going to improve the provision of public services locally, which for another of my points, that might slow down the pace of urbanization in the short run. But if those decentralized governments turn out to have equally powerful presidents and few constraints on their ability to operate, then that might just decentralize inefficient infrastructure building. Question, the crudity of this, there's more nuance. I mean, I would agree absolutely. My research question here is very broad and aggregate. It's trying to explain differential patterns of urbanization at a national level across 8 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, 5 countries in South Asia, and using a fairly crude definition of urbanization, that proportion of people living in urban areas. So I agree completely, and I think there's a lot of scope to take the discussion, the research down to a more disaggregated level. So who is migrating? Are they young people, old people? Are they women? Are they men? Are they moving? Which cities are they moving to? Are they moving to the capital city, to secondary cities? Are they moving between cities? Are they migrating nationally across local borders or across international borders globally? So there's a lot more nuance at disaggregated levels this research could continue into, but I don't think you can't do everything in one seminar. Sixth, so proportion. So what fraction of urbanization is explained by rural to urban migration? Which fraction explained by the natural growth of cities? I mean, very broadly, I estimated that about 60% of urbanization is explained by rural to urban migration, and the rest is explained by natural growth of cities. That's fertility and mortality within cities, and then that number has differed over time quite dramatically. It also differs between countries. So it's like a relatively crude bit of the presentation and does deserve a bit more research. I do agree. But it's probably about 60% of urbanization is explained by rural to urban migration. Urbanization and the environment. I'm a kind of an urban optimist in the sense that good urbanization can reduce per capita energy consumption. Where you have greater density of population, it's easier to provide energy people need to travel at lower distances in order to shop or access public services or work. It's easier to, it's more energy efficient to warm or provide air conditioning, whatever, for people in a tower block than people dispersed across lots of different villages. So a densely good urbanization, which is relatively dense, is a more energy efficient pattern of economic growth than either living in lots of villages. So I'm an urban optimist when it comes to the environment, but it also depends on the type of urbanization, which is not something I dwelt on in this presentation. If urbanization is sprawling at low level, which is probably characteristic of much of Nairobi, characteristic of North American cities, that is a more environmentally damaging pattern of urbanization than if urbanization is relatively dense and urbanization is going upwards, 5, 10 plus story buildings, as it did in Seoul or Tokyo historically. That is a more energy efficient pattern of urbanization. Agglomeration, I think that was one of questions from Wellington. One of the dynamic benefits of cities is to facilitate agglomeration, knowledge spillovers, workers to be able to access firms, firms to be able to access suppliers, firms to be able to access raw materials, firms to be able to then access, I don't know, ports or airports in order to export goods and services, researchers to meet with each, and facilitates those kind of spillovers and agglomeration externalities. So, I mean, research shows, for example, that building infrastructure makes it more likely for researchers to cite each other in Chinese cities. So when two Chinese cities are connected up by high-speed railway, the citations between researchers in separate cities increases. And it's a nice little measure of research spillovers. However, when urbanization proceeds on the basis of poor public infrastructure, it's very difficult time to travel of knowledge or other spillovers. And research does show that cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, the actual city one can access in an hour's traveling is only a small part of the overall city. So scholars like Alan Berthaud say the functioning city is what workers or firms can access within 1 hour. So it makes no sense to build a big bread factory in Nairobi, a big efficient bread factory, and try and supply the entirety of the city because of congestion, transport problems, and so on. What it makes sense is to have a proliferation of small bread factories, each supplying a local market. So that's an example. You can't exploit economies of scale in production because of problems in transport. So it's an example of a kind of an agglomeration externality that is not being realized in a city like Nairobi because of problems associated with transport. So I think I got with that. Maybe there was another question from Wellington, but anyway, happy to pass over back to yourself, Radha, if there's any more.
Yes, I'll just take Wellington's. There are no more other questions in the chat, but I'll take Wellington's fourth question, the fourth question, which was something I was thinking about as well, about the role of like the different colonization patterns and whether that has an impact. Albert Nitti has asked that from an urban planning perspective, one factor that could be peculiar to Kenya is the land tenure system. The urbanization rate in Kenya may seem lower to counterparts like Tanzania because the two countries practice two different land tenure systems. While Kenya has predominantly freeholding private ownership, in Tanzania, public land is vested in the custodian of the president. In these two scenarios, it is much easier for Tanzanians to access land both formally and informally than it is for Kenyans. So a comment on that. have two of my own other question. I think, like, as a development economist, I didn't feel like a lot of the urban issues that I face, like, just as a person, all the 33 years of development economics that I've learned, but recently for other things that I've been working on, like finance issues, I found some of the theories from economic geographers very interesting. And I was just wondering whether I don't know the literature in this area in economic geography on kind of urbanization and migration, but have you found any of like economic geography theories that would be additional explanations? And then it's just a very kind of just a very broad question. Most of the people on this call are IDS master students, and all our students kind of struggle. Most of them have like significant policy experience. They're kind of practitioners working in the development space, but they always struggle to kind of link theory to their research. So if you have maybe just some kind of broad advice on that, that would be useful.
Thank you, Radha. Okay, so colonization. Wow, it's like big questions. Ethiopia is an exception, but I think all of the rest were either British or French colonies. So we're not talking about a kind of a non-colonized, colonized distinction here. I don't think it's the big difference, because all of the South Asian countries were British colonies. I think probably a good chunk of the Sub-Saharan African sample were British, but we've still got the British, ex-British, Sub-Saharan African countries. They're urbanizing faster than the British South Asian countries. So I think the difference is probably not colonialism. I don't think that's really explaining why they. I mean, it's an interesting question worth looking at. I think it's the geography of there's a South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa distinction here on distinctions between French colonies and British colonies. I've looked at British colonies, but that's a kind of more disaggregated comparison, comparing cities within Sub-Saharan Africa rather than the more aggregate level that I've been working on, trying to explain this Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia distinction. Kenya compared to Tanzania. So Tanzania, yes, I guess it has its socialist background. Ethiopia as well, land was nationalized in the 70s. And what I understand, it's relatively easier to get access to land in those countries where land was nationalized or ownership or control of is vested in the president than if there's a proliferation of a customary land tenure or informal or overlapping land tenures. If that were the case, then we would probably be expecting to see land ownership as a key variable. We might be expecting, say, Tanzania and Kenya urbanizing faster than the rest of the countries because they've got land ownership control vested in the president and the state. So that would be, I guess, the hypothesis. Whether there's a distinct Tanzania, Ethiopia rapid urbanization that's more rapid than the rest, I'm not sure the data shows that. So I think that's an interesting explanation, but at the very aggregate level that I'm engaged with here, I don't think that's really explaining the distinctions between South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Urbanization and economics. So yeah, this is sort of the last 5 years or so have been a bit of an epiphany, or I guess for me, that I guess like Radha, I've done economics, development economics, we've done institutions and poverty and urbanization, industrialization, exports, productivity and employment, inequality, and so on. We talked about all of those topics without putting them under an umbrella of urbanization. And that's just, economists don't like talking about space. There's even a suspicion in Oxford when they set up the area studies department. Economics were saying, well, why are you doing this? Because there's no such thing as a Indian economics or a Tanzania economics. There's just economics. You don't root the study of economics in a particular place. It was a controversial issue to set up area studies. And I think as a result of that, you pick up any basic textbook in economics, development economics, go to the index, they don't talk about urbanization or cities. So where do you learn about cities as an economist? You have to leave economics departments, and you find people talking about the economics of cities in geography departments, or like sort of Albert in specifically urban studies institute. So that, I think, the importance of economists talking about cities is how cities are going to grow, the potential for good urbanization to promote rapid economic and social development, or bad urbanization to hinder economic growth and social development, is so profound that I think huge importance for economists to talk more about cities. I also think, as a comment on that, the other way don't talk about economics enough. They'll draw a master plan with no reference to how markets work, demand and supply for land. They'll pencil in, this is going to be a high density area, this is going to be an affordable density area, and then land markets work very differently in practice, and the affordable housing suddenly becomes expensive housing, and urban planners are a bit puzzled why this is happening, and they talk about enforcing the plan rather than trying to understand how economics is working. Policy people and theory. I think this is partly the problem of economists. Economists have been accused of making common sense very difficult. Economists have created a language, a kind of very formal mathematical approach to the subject, which can make it very inaccessible to people within the discipline, which is a shame. There's not enough social in the social science, development studies people, anthropologists, political science people, everyone else in social sciences, chatting and exchanging ideas, and you find economists sitting in their bunkers quite separate from the rest of the social sciences. So I think in part this is a problem of economists in creating a discipline that is very inaccessible for other people in the social sciences. But theory should, dare I say, should be your friend, because theory makes a complicated world simple. It gives you a very simple question to ask. So, for example, the theory of comparative advantage says that urbanization should be faster in more densely populated countries. Those countries with a comparative advantage in urbanization, industrialization, they should be urbanizing faster. So India should be urbanizing faster than Kenya because population density in India is much greater. So it's a theory. It gives you a very simple question to ask. It tells you what data to look at. But in our case, the data clearly does not support the theory. So it's well, why is urbanization faster in Kenya than it is in India, despite the predictions of the theory of comparative advantage? Is the theory wrong? Do we need another theory to explain what's going on? So in this hugely complicated, confusing world of social sciences in general, urbanization in particular, theory is useful because it gives you a very simple, it tells you what questions to ask, it tells you what data you should be looking for.
Okay, so before we close, maybe I can ask Priya if she just wants to reflect on one or two of the questions, just for like 1 or 2 minutes. And just to add, actually, that's one of the things I really like about IDS. We're a very interdisciplinary department. So it's not just like the complexity of economics, sort of, or like the narrow-mindedness of economics, which is partly why, I kind of chose to work at IDS. But in general, I feel there's a sort of fear of theory among students, which is sometimes unfounded. So thank you for your response. Priya, do you have maybe just one or two reflections on maybe you can either pick one of the questions and respond, or just maybe anything before we close?
Okay, I think rather going for one particular question, like I would say, like looking at the questions in the chat altogether, I felt yes, now when we are trying to understand why things happen in a certain way in Kenya, why there's rapid urbanization. So when we question why, as Professor Matthew mentioned, now here we are looking through a certain lenses, but there can be many other, let's say, social values, social attitudes of people can also have an impact on these migrations and their location choices when it comes to urbanization. So I think these types of social factors also can play a role in terms of urbanization. Now, for an example, in one of the previous discussion, again, I mentioned to Professor Matthew, when we are reflecting on the urbanization in Sri Lanka, we are sort of observing a stalled urbanization or a slow phase of urbanization. There can be many reasons, but within that, even the social attitudes and the values of people also can play a big role in terms of the decision to migrate or to live in a rural area. So therefore, these types of factors also can be there. And then maybe like the final remarks, I was thinking about maybe this might look philosophical, but I would like to share it as the final thought, the rural-urban migrations and urbanization. So we assume that there are two distinct or separate categories, like urban and standing of urban and rural. However, I feel like this distinction, instead of viewing it as a binary, right? If we look at it as a continuum, so with blurred boundaries, because in reality, I think there are lots of blurred boundaries when it comes to urban and rural. There's no clear-cut black and white distinctions on spaces. So for an instance, like one may live away from the city, a major city, in a low-density agricultural dominant area, yet still globally connected, have access to, pipe-borne water, electricity, all context, right? It becomes difficult to categorize, space strictly as either urban or rural. So it can be a blend of all these, characteristics. So yeah. So maybe people not migrate, but they will be there in the same place, but the space will transform, and the attributes of the space can change over a period. There can be spectrum on ground. So that's something I felt while listening to all these questions. So yeah, with that, I would like to end my comments. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And it's a very interesting session.
Thank you so much. Thank you both to Matthew and Priya, all of you who attended. On behalf of IDS, I'll bring this seminar to a close and really appreciate everyone who attended today. And thank you for your really interesting questions. Basil has put the details of our next seminar, which is Thursday, 7th May, in the chat. So please do sign up for that. And please do stay in touch with the IDS. We really appreciate all this engagement. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. And I think tomorrow is probably one of the few days that's a holiday all over the world. So I hope you all get some relaxation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
As well.
It's actually not a holiday in the UK, yeah?
No,
The Labor Day.
everywhere else. So, all right. Take care. Lovely to you.
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Cheers,
Thank
Professor.
Bye,
Thank you,
Wellington.
Radha. Thank you, Priya. Priya, I hope you email me.
Thanks, Priya.
Hi, Priya. I sent you something there. I don't know if you saw the message. I want your email address.
Okay, okay. I'll check. Sorry,
All right.
I
Thank
missed
you
this
so
one.
much. Okay,
Okay.
bye.
Goodbye.